For 11 years, I thought my company was my second home. I was the guy who came in early, stayed late, answered calls on weekends, and never said no when my boss needed help. I honestly believed loyalty still meant something. Then, one Friday afternoon, my boss called me into his office and told me I was fired. No warning, no performance review, no explanation. Just 3 words that completely changed my life. "Today is your last day." I remember looking at him and asking, "Why?" He didn't even look me in the eyes. He pushed a folder across the desk and said the company was restructuring. I walked out carrying a cardboard box with 11 years of my life inside it. My coworkers looked shocked. Some of them wouldn't even make eye contact with me. I thought I had simply been replaced by someone younger and cheaper. I went home that night and told my wife I had lost my job. She hugged me and told me we'd figure it out. For the next few days, I started applying everywhere. Then, on Tuesday morning, I received an email from my former company's IT department. It said someone had attempted to access my old employee account after my termination. I ignored it at first. I figured it was an automated mistake. But then I noticed the login time. 2:13 a.m., and the location was my old office. Someone had used my credentials after I was fired. I changed every password I had, called the company, and asked what was going on. The IT manager became strangely quiet. He finally said, "You should probably talk to your former boss." I called my boss. He didn't answer. Instead, I received a text from him saying, "Stop asking questions." That was the first moment I became suspicious. Why would a man who had supposedly fired me for restructuring care whether I asked questions? I started looking through old emails I had saved during my 11 years at the company. I wasn't looking for revenge. I just wanted to understand what had happened. And then I found an old spreadsheet. It contained payments made to several vendors. At first, everything looked normal. But one company name caught my attention because I had never seen it before. I searched the address. It led to a tiny office building across town. Then I noticed something strange. The company was owned by someone with the same last name as my boss. I kept digging. The more I looked, the stranger it became. Payments had been made to that company almost every month for years, and several of those payments had been approved using my department's authorization code. My authorization code. I immediately thought someone had made a mistake. Then I checked the dates. Some approvals had happened while I was on vacation. Others happened after I had already been fired. I sat there staring at my laptop, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then suddenly, my phone rang. It was my former coworker, Mike. He sounded terrified. He said, "You need to stop looking at those files." I asked him how he knew what I was looking at. He went silent. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Because you're not the only person who got fired for finding them." He hung up. I called him back. Nothing. I tried again. Nothing. That night, around midnight, I heard my front door handle move. I froze. Someone was trying to get inside. I grabbed my phone and called the police, but before I could say anything, the person outside walked away. When I checked the security camera, I saw a man standing near my driveway. His face was hidden under a hood. But he wasn't looking at the house. He was looking directly at my car. The next morning, I found an envelope underneath my windshield wiper. There was no name on it. Inside was a single photograph of my old office. On the back, someone had written 6 words. "You were never supposed to see this." And that's when I realized getting fired wasn't the punishment. It was the warning. I didn't sleep that night. I kept staring at the photograph on my kitchen table, trying to figure out who had sent it. Then, at 6:42 a.m., my phone rang again. It was Mike. His voice was barely a whisper. "Meet me somewhere public." We met at a coffee shop 20 minutes from the office. Mike looked exhausted. He told me that 6 months earlier, he had discovered unusual payments inside the company's accounting system. He reported them to management. 2 weeks later, he was fired. I asked him why he had never told me. He said, Because they made sure I understood what would happen if I talked. Then he pulled a USB drive from his pocket and placed it on the table. Everything I found is on this. I asked him what was inside. He looked around the coffee shop before answering. Your boss isn't stealing money by himself. I felt my stomach drop. He explained that the company had created fake vendor accounts and moved money through them. But the money wasn't the biggest problem. The bigger problem was how they were covering it up. Employee credentials were being used to approve transactions. Employees who questioned the payments were fired. Their accounts were then used again after termination to make it look like they had authorized everything. And my name was one of the names they were using. Suddenly, the mysterious IT email made sense. Someone had been using my account after I was fired because they needed a dead employee to take the blame. Mike told me he had copied evidence before he left. But he was missing one important piece. He needed the original authorization records from my department. I still had access to some old files because of a backup drive I had taken home years earlier for work. I went home and found it. And there it was, hundreds of records, dates, approval codes, employee IDs, payment numbers. Then I noticed something impossible. One of the largest payments had been approved using my credentials on the exact day I was sitting beside my wife in a hospital waiting room. There was no way I had made that approval. I showed Mike. He looked at the screen and said, "This is it." We contacted an attorney and gave him copies of everything. He told us not to confront my boss. So we waited. 3 days later, my former boss called me. His voice was completely different this time. He sounded nervous. He offered me my job back. Not only that, he offered me a huge raise. I asked him why. He said the company had made a mistake. I asked what kind of mistake gets someone fired after 11 years and then offers them twice their salary 3 days later. He didn't answer. Then he said, "Just come back, sign the paperwork, and forget what happened." I told him I needed time to think. He said, "You have until tomorrow." I hung up. That night, something happened that changed everything. I opened the USB drive Mike had given me. There was a folder I hadn't seen before. Inside was a video file. I clicked play. It showed a meeting inside my former boss's office. I watched my boss sitting across from 2 executives. Then I heard my own name. They were discussing me. They knew I had access to the old records. They knew I had noticed the payments. And then my boss said something that made me stop breathing. "If Daniel leaves voluntarily, we're safe. If he doesn't, we'll make sure he leaves." I paused the video. I couldn't move. 11 years of loyalty suddenly felt like a joke. But there was one more voice in that recording. A voice I recognized immediately. It belonged to someone I had trusted for years. And that person wasn't just involved. They were the one who had been giving my boss information about everything I was doing. The person giving my boss information was my own department manager, the man who had trained me when I first joined the company. For 11 years, I had trusted him. I had shared projects with him, covered for him, and even defended him when other employees complained. Now I was hearing his voice in a secret recording, discussing how to remove me from the company. I gave the recording to my attorney. He told me something I wasn't expecting. "Don't do anything. Let them think they won." So I did. The next morning, I called my former boss and accepted his offer to return. He sounded relieved. I went back to the office wearing the same employee badge I had returned days earlier. Everyone stared at me. My manager shook my hand and smiled like nothing had happened. "Glad to have you back," he said. I smiled back. But this time, I knew exactly who I was dealing with. I spent the next 2 weeks doing exactly what they expected. I answered emails. I attended meetings. I acted like I had forgotten everything. Meanwhile, my attorney was working with investigators. Then one afternoon, my boss called me into his office. He placed a document in front of me and told me to sign it. It was a legal agreement saying I had no claims against the company and would never discuss its financial records. I looked at the document and asked, "Why do you need this?" He smiled and said, "It's just standard procedure." I knew it wasn't. I told him I'd sign it the next morning. He agreed. That evening, I received a message from my attorney. "Tomorrow morning. Don't go to work." I didn't understand why. Then at 8:07 a.m., my phone started exploding with notifications. Investigators had entered the company. They were reviewing financial records, employee accounts, emails, and bank transactions. My former boss had no idea that the agreement he wanted me to sign had become part of the evidence, showing he knew exactly what he was doing. The investigation continued for months. The fake vendors were discovered. The unauthorized payments were traced. Employee accounts were examined. And eventually, the company admitted that several employees had been used to hide the transactions. My former manager was fired. My boss was removed from his position. And the company had to answer questions about years of financial activity. But the most emotional moment came later. I received a letter from the company's new leadership. They apologized for firing me. They admitted that my termination had been connected to my questions about the financial records. They offered me my old position back with a massive salary increase. I turned it down. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood something I hadn't understood when I was 24. Loyalty means nothing when the people you're loyal to don't respect you. Today, I work somewhere else. I still think about that cardboard box I carried out of the office that Friday afternoon. At the time, I thought it represented everything I had lost. Now I see it differently. That box wasn't carrying the end of my career. It was carrying the beginning of my freedom. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my boss had never fired me. Maybe I would have stayed there another 10 years. Maybe I would have kept trusting the wrong people. Maybe I would have never discovered the truth. So if you're watching this because you've ever been treated unfairly at work, remember this. Getting fired can feel like the worst thing that ever happened to you. But sometimes the door that gets slammed in your face is the same door protecting you from something you can't see. And in my case, my boss thought firing me would silence me. He had no idea. It was the reason the truth finally came out.